I'm Brian Kilmeade.
I'm Martha McCallum.
I'm David Asman, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, March 24th, 2021. I'm Dave Anthony. Democrats long claimed former President Trump was trying to steal an election. Now Republicans allege House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is trying to steal a seat.
With so many questions about election integrity, how are people supposed to believe that their votes count in elections if whoever the majority party is in Congress can just overturn the results of elections that don't work out in their favor?
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. After 2 shootings in 1 week, the president is calling for new gun legislation.
The background check system was created 27 years ago, and we've had no update to this.
But for others, the proposed laws go down the wrong path.
You get rid of the AR. You don't think there's going to be things out there that are just as deadly and just as accessible? Of course there are.
And I'm KT McFarland. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Congresswoman Mariannette Miller Meeks is only 2.5 months into her first term, but there is a push to kick her out of the House. The Democrat she beat in November isn't giving up yet.
They skipped over the Iowa course because they thought they would lose.
Miller Meeks' margin of victory was just 6 votes. But Rita Hart contends she won because some ballots were not counted, and she has gone to the Democrat-led House, which by law could overturn the result and give Hart the seat. It's happened 3 times dating back to the 1930s.
They would disenfranchise 400,000 Iowa voters in order to get the results they need.
Congresswoman Miller Meeks insists
everybody should be outraged about this because it may be Iowa 2 this year, but it could be another congressional seat in another year.
But Democratic Congressman David Price tells Fox, hold on.
Well, I wouldn't talk about overriding. I would talk about a lawful process that the House Administration Committee has underway, and we'll just have to see what that process produces.
The committee itself can't make the change. If it recommends Hart take the seat, the full House would have to approve that. And at least one Democrat, Congressman Dean Phillips, says he'd vote against removing Miller Meeks. Another new congresswoman from Iowa is going to bat for her colleague.
The situation it's very uncertain at this point, but the votes for Mariannette Miller Meeks, my fellow congresswoman here from Iowa, were counted. They were recounted here in Iowa, and then they were certified by a bipartisan board.
Ashley Hinson represents Iowa's 1st House district.
The number one thing I've been hearing from my constituents and other Iowans is that they're just outraged that the Speaker Pelosi is moving forward at this point to try to overturn the will of Iowa voters and election results that were certified here by the state. And so what I did was I led a letter of over 100 of my House and Senate colleagues to the Speaker on behalf of Iowans and Americans who are angered by this. It's hypocritical of Nancy Pelosi to support an investigation into this free and fair election, while at the same time she's saying voter fraud doesn't exist across the country. So we're standing up. We don't believe 6 Democrats on the House Administration Committee should be able to overturn 6 votes that were cast by Iowans that were the deciding difference in this race.
The issue, from what I understand in this race, the Democrat who is challenging Mariannette Miller Meeks, Rita Hart, alleges that there were 22 ballots that should have been counted and they weren't. If they had been, she would have won by 9 votes. Instead, she lost by 6. And so she's taking it to the House Administration Committee, and they say it's a lawful process for the House to review. Why can't she do that?
Well, I think it's very clear that these ballots didn't meet the muster of state law, and that's why they were not counted in the recount process. A judge ruled, as they were going through this whole recount process several months ago, that those did not meet the requirement. And I'm not exactly sure if every single one of them was the same in terms of the requirement, but, we have laws about when those ballots have to be received, how they have to be postmarked, and if ballots don't meet those requirements, then they're not counted or they're not a valid ballot. And so our bipartisan board, as I mentioned in the state, certified that election after those recounts happened, and they determined that Mariannette won by 6 votes. So I think this is a terrible precedent to set, going around the will of Iowa voters and the court process here in Iowa and Iowa law, ultimately. States have the purview over their elections, and at this point, I think, with so many questions about election integrity, how are people supposed to believe that their votes count in elections if whoever the majority party is in Congress can just overturn the results of elections that don't work out in their favor. And so that's why we're pushing this to make sure that they know that here in Iowa we run safe and secure elections, and our state has not indicated that it has questions about what happened in November. So this election was certified and it should stand, and Nancy Pelosi should not try to steal this seat.
Have you talked to any of the 10 Republicans in the House who voted to impeach President Trump for inciting the deadly Capitol attack, but have come out on your side on this issue and saying that they are being consistent, that they can't be opposed to what happened then and then before what's happening now?
Well, I think the impeachment vote is separate of what happened here with the certification of a state election. And I think I would point to, in general, at the start of session, every member, I believe, of Congress, maybe save one, voted to certify their own election to Congress. And so to me, the argument here is no matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats, it's hypocrisy to say that you certify your own election. Nancy Pelosi even sent a letter to Marionette saying, congratulations on your election to Congress. Welcome to Congress. And so I think it's about the hypocrisy here, regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat. And we're starting to see Democrats come out and say that just because you can do this doesn't mean you should. And I do think, again, this is about hypocrisy and setting a terrible precedent.
Well, I mean, I guess to be devil's advocate, Democrats could say that Republicans tried to undo an electoral college certification, ballots that were certified by all 50 states, correct?
Well, I would say some probably did, but ultimately, when I look at, I've been remarkably consistent on this issue because I believe that we have to follow the Constitution. And that was true with the presidential election. That's true with this election. The state of Iowa counted, recounted, and certified these votes. And it's my job in Congress to make sure that we follow the Constitution, which allows states to have purview over their own elections.
Now we switch to an issue that dates back to last spring, when COVID closed schools. Some are still not open again. Here's Congresswoman Hinson the other day on the House floor.
The science on this is definitive. If certain safety precautions are taken, teachers and students can resume in-person learning safely.
And she is advocating legislation to push schools to bring kids back.
Congress has sent literally billions of dollars out to schools across the country to get schools back open. Students and teachers can be back in the classroom safely, and we are experiencing in this country an academic crisis and a mental health crisis. Child depression rates are up, youth suicide rates are up. The mental health toll on our students is too high. Parents need the certainty as well. So what I'm advocating for is let's get these kids back in the classroom across the country. Iowa has done it safely, so we're a great model for how you can do that and provide an in-person learning option. But what we need is accountability. We've got, again, $54 billion that went out in December to get schools back open, and another almost $130 billion in the most recent stimulus package that just went through. So that money is designed to help go get schools open, and we need the accountability there, that they actually have a plan and they actually go through with that plan to get kids back in the classroom.
So you would have specific rules for states, communities? How would it work?
Right. So what we were advocating for is that we kind of divide the money up into thirds. A third of the money would go out the door to schools right away, the cash infusion that they need to get their plans up and running. But the other 2/3 of the money would be contingent upon actually developing a plan to get reopened and provide an in-person learning option, 50% of students, 50% of the time, and then actually getting that plan to a governor and then following through and opening up. So it was truly designed to be a program implemented by the states to actually get these dollars to classrooms and get those kids back in classrooms safely. So we just wanted some accountability with the money that's going out because we're talking about billions of dollars here and thousands of students that are falling off the grid, now entering a second year without being in a classroom. The longer the kids are out of the classroom, the more unacceptable it becomes, both the mental health challenges and the longer parents are having to balance work with homeschooling. It's a huge crisis for our country and a huge challenge for our students.
You, several months ago, tested positive for the coronavirus. Was your case mild?
Yes, I was incredibly lucky. I had a very mild case, just a little bit of, I would call it exhaustion, and a little mild taste loss, but I bounced back very quickly. But I think what was impactful to me in experiencing COVID myself was, our family has been through several quarantines in the last year. I know what that impact has on a family. And I also know what it's like to experience the virus. My husband also had it, and at the same time. So, we've been through it, and that's why I'm trying to advocate to get as much vaccine out in the state of Iowa as possible so we can get back to normal as quickly as possible.
The next big thing in Congress could be even bigger than the nearly $2 trillion COVID financial aid bill. An infrastructure package President Biden's working with Democrats on that could be worth $3 trillion. Congressman Ro Khanna tells Fox he wants
to actually invest in job creation, in artificial intelligence, in clean energy, in quantum computing, in synthetic biology to outcompete with China.
Democrats also might try to include free college tuition for some, universal pre-kindergarten education, and paid family leave. Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell warns
it may actually be a Trojan horse for massive tax hikes and other job-killing left-wing policies.
Now, infrastructure improvements are important to Congresswoman Hinson.
I think the number one priority for me is I want to make sure small states like Iowa are not forgotten in a big infrastructure package. We have a lock and dam system that's vulnerable and needs upgrades to make sure that our agricultural products can get to market. The Mississippi obviously is a huge part of our river economy here in Iowa and many other states up and down the Mississippi. So I just want to make sure that Iowa isn't forgotten in any of these big packages that we're talking about. We haven't seen an official proposal yet at the committee level, but priorities for me in infrastructure are not just the roads and bridges, but like I said, the lock and dam system. And then also, I think it is really important to have the conversation about broadband infrastructure as well and how that fits in. So I'm hoping that all of those things can be part of this package discussion. I was touring a local mental health access center, and they have a whole room devoted to telehealth. You need broadband to be able to do telehealth. And so those are issues that I see as very pressing for our country, and I'm hopeful that whatever package is worked on includes provisions like that are beneficial to Iowa.
Obviously, there's a lot of partisanship involved in this, though, because you have Republicans fearing that it's going to be too big and tax hikes are going to be part of the deal.
Right. And that is a concern. I mean, I think we have to be cognizant of how much money we're spending. That's why you saw, many members of our conference step up against what we perceive to be wasteful spending in that last COVID-19 supposed relief package, because there was a lot of spending in there that was not related to the pandemic. I would rather see, if we're going to be making those decisions, spending decisions, that we go through the right channels. We actually have committee discussions about them. Both parties get input, and we're able to move forward on a package that's the best thing for the American people. So I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to move forward in that direction. Our Appropriations Committee, we are cordially working together. I'm seeing that every day. So I'm definitely hopeful that we'll be able to do that going forward.
Will you support any tax increases if it's in the proposal?
I don't support tax increases right now. I think that this is not the time to be pulling the rug out from anyone. If anything, I think we need to be giving people long-term tax certainty. I'm hearing from people right now, they're concerned. They don't want to make investments. They don't want to make those investments long-term because they don't know what is ahead. And I think that's a scary thing for our country and for our economy right now, coming out of a pandemic. I'll be looking at it very closely because I don't think we should be raising taxes on the American people right now.
Congresswoman Ashley Hinson, Republican from Iowa, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Dave, for having me. I appreciate the chance to talk with you.
This is KT McFarland with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
President Biden ordered flags at half staff for the 10 victims in the Boulder, Colorado supermarket shooting. Each of the victims' names was announced at a press conference Tuesday, headed by Boulder Police Chief Maris Harold.
To have something like this happen so close to where you live, and to know the fear in the community, and to know that the officers sacrifice themselves, it's heartbreaking.
A 21-year-old from Arvada, Colorado, has been arrested and charged with 10 counts of murder for the shooting at a King Soopers grocery store. But in Washington, the conversation pivoted to guns. During remarks at the White House Tuesday, President Biden acknowledged the victims and said it's time for additional gun legislation, urging the House and Senate to act.
We can ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines in this country once again. I got that done when I was a senator. It passed. It was law for the longest time. And it brought down these mass killings. We should do it again. We can close the loopholes in our background check system.
He noted that the House just passed legislation expanding background checks and giving the FBI more time to vet potential buyers. But getting 60 votes in the Senate to get those House bills to a vote seems unlikely per Republicans. The Senate Judiciary Committee had a hearing on gun violence Tuesday. It was scheduled before the shootings in Atlanta and Boulder. Illinois Democratic Senator Dick Durbin asked senators to act.
We won't solve this crisis with just prosecutions after funerals. We need prevention before shooting.
But Republican Texas Senator Ted Cruz said the kind of legislation being proposed would have done nothing to stop many of the mass shootings. He said he and another Republican senator have better solutions.
Senator Grassley and I together introduced legislation, Grassley-Cruz, targeted at violent criminals, targeted at felons, targeted at fugitives, targeted at those with serious mental disease, to stop them from getting firearms, to put them in prison when they try to illegally buy guns.
But again, the question is now the time new legislation will pass, with the House, Senate, and White House dominated by Democrats?
We, as a gun violence prevention movement, know that the American people have spoken on these issues over and over and over again.
Chris Brown is the president of Brady United, which calls itself a gun violence prevention organization.
In every major campaign that's happened in the last several years, we want change. And if the Senate can't bring H.R. 8 or H.R. 1446, the two bills to close gaps in the background check system that were created over the last 27 years, just to be clear, the background check system was created 27 years ago, and we've had no update to this. If we can't pass these measures that 90+% of Americans believe need to be in place in the U.S. Senate, if 60% of the U.S. Senate can't do that, then we need to end the filibuster. The time is now, because literally, if that can't happen, it means people are dying in this country because of this filibuster.
Yeah, let me ask you, let's drill down on that, because Democrats are in charge now. You would think they could get something done in the vein of what you want. But they do need those 60 votes. And we have heard from Republicans that they feel these House bills are too expansive for them. I imagine you or your members of your organization have actually spoken with Republican senators. What is your understanding of what could pass? What would they go for if not these bills?
The kinds of issues that are raised with me around these bills honestly leave me a little incredulous. It's things like, I'm concerned about the ability for individuals to transfer guns interfamilial, a grandfather to a grandson or a parent to a child. All of those exceptions are put into this measure. Either you can do it intestate through your will, and that will pass down, and it's fully allowed by H.R. 8, or out of safety, all you have to do is go to a local gun dealer and finalize a transaction and conduct a background check. Either way, these are the kinds of things that are done every day across this country and communities across this country without any issue. So when I hear legislators claiming that H.R. 8 would somehow interfere with families passing down guns over the generations, or a mother giving a gun to her son or child, that's already been covered in this bill. So it's hard for me to imagine that that is much more than a talking point that I have heard over and over again for the last 40 years.
Let me ask you, Chris, I know this is a bit of a sensitive question, but so many of the mass shootings, when you look at them, it turns out the people who got the gun would not necessarily have been stopped by a background check, or they passed the background check. Many of them are younger. They don't have criminal records. There is no red flag. Let's say you succeed. Let's say you get your, expanded background check legislation. Let's say all the things you want happen. in many cases, people will still get firearms if they want them and go on to commit crimes with them and go on to use them for nefarious purposes or commit mass shootings. As I just said, so many of these stories, we find out later that the person easily passed the background check or never had a problem, never had that red flag. So what do you say in those instances?
So the way this works is not looking at a particular incident and saying, what law could have prevented this, and saying, okay, we need to pass that law. It's saying what laws in conjunction can save the most people. And I can tell you, with Brady being in effect for 40 years and talking to people and having friends who survived the Harvest Festival, who survived Aurora, who survived Virginia Tech, they want a comprehensive solution, and whether any of those things could have saved them or not is immaterial. They want this to be addressed as a public health issue, and they are certain, as am I, as are victims across this country, that if we do that and invest in that, which we can tomorrow, without a single person being denied the right to access, buy, and carry a gun as they wish, who's not prohibited for some other reason, we can save many lives in this country and end an epidemic of gun violence that is a uniquely American problem.
But some Second Amendment supporters believe the end goal with gun laws, including the two most recently passed in the House, is to slowly move to a place where Americans' guns are taken away. Retired Staff Sergeant Johnny Joey Jones is the host of Fox Nation Outdoors and a Fox News contributor.
Well, I think that Nancy Pelosi knows that she doesn't have a lot of support for a broad gun bill right now in the Senate, and really doesn't have a large one in the House. And so those, not to talk too long, but those two bills specifically, the first one, when you talk about broad and universal background checks, what they're talking about is doing away with person-to-person transfer, which was originally kept out of the NICS system law that passed with NRA support because of family members and friends that go hunting together, stuff like that. A big part of the gun culture and community is that you buy and sell guns among your friends, and it's a community thing, and that's a big part of the culture. The second one, 1446, they're calling it the Charleston loophole bill. But if you actually read what happened with Charleston, it would not have prevented what happened in Charleston. That man used that gun 33 days after he purchased it, and this bill would extend that 3-day period to a 20-day period. What happened there, and the FBI has admitted it, they dropped the ball. They did not finalize his background check. And if he were a law-abiding citizen and the FBI did that to 100 million people, that'd be a problem. So that's why that sunset exists.
It's interesting because the head of the Brady campaign was telling us that the person-to-person transfer, at least among family members, is protected.
It is to an extent. And I when I look at this bill, I'll tell you, as a very much a pro-gun guy, H.R. 8 has more legs, as a guy with no legs, than any gun bill I've seen, simply because what it tells me tactically, and this is obviously looking at both of these bills prior to the past week's events, is that there was not a lot of appetite among the American people, or at least the Senate, to pass a big gun bill. So even this bill, H.R. 8, has two provisions. One would be family-to-family transfer, and the other one would be temporary transfer to a friend on like a hunting trip. The problem is those things are so hard to define, and also, what do they prevent? They don't prevent anything. They're punitive after the fact, and that's the problem.
Let's talk about what pro 2A folks maybe would go for or support if we're going to talk about changing gun laws. Polling has shown Americans would be okay with some new legislation, especially pertaining to background checks. Then again, there were 21 million background checks done, I think it was in 2020, for gun purchases. And the National Firearm Trade Association estimated that 8 million of those were first-time gun buyers. I mean, you just referenced the appetite for new laws. What would 2A supporters go for, if anything?
Here's the problem, right? If you're a pro-gun person, you feel like if you give an inch, they take a mile. So what would Second Amendment supporters go for? They would go for a honest legislature a Democrat Party that doesn't advocate for banning and confiscating guns on one hand and saying, but we just want to extend background checks on the other. There needs to be trust. And if you broker trust, and I don't know how you do it today, then you look at gun laws and say, okay, what isn't working that should be working? The NICS is a great example. In the past year, I've waited 2 minutes, 2 hours, 2 days, 2 weeks, and almost a month. And obviously that's an anecdote, but all of those are true. I've waited days, weeks, almost a month, and minutes with the same name, same background, same everything. And that is the problem. We don't grow our resources for background checks as the supply and demand grows. And this is a 3-year hump, not a 1-year hump. The gun purchases have been growing for multiple years, and the FBI or the NICS system can't keep up with it. And what we're saying is, show me you're serious by investing in that and make that work efficiently, and then let's go from there. And if that got included to say like HR 8, then you might have a conversation.
Johnny, finally, what's the solution in your mind to mass shootings? We've had this conversation before. We hear about mental health. We hear about, additional security at locations. We know Ted Cruz and Senator Grassley, they're trying to come up with legislation that, addresses things differently, that addresses criminal activity. What is the solution, if anything?
Well, let me propose something to you. During the first assault weapons ban, all right, you had Ted Kaczynski, Eric Rudolph, you had 9/11, you had Timothy McVeigh, you had Columbine, actually. That was a shotgun and a pistol. And in 2007, you had the Virginia Tech incident, was for 2 pistols. And pistols specifically are semi-automatic guns that have the most protections under federal law and Supreme Court decisions today. So it'd be very, very difficult to ban those. And my point there being is I just don't know that mass shootings are the gun violence problem we should be worried about. Is it something we should be worried about? Of course. But my point there is when we went and we saw bombings happening and terrorist attacks happening, we didn't prevent the methods. We prevented the incidents and the people, and we did a really good job at it by investing in federal resources to sniff these out and prohibit or prevent them beforehand. And I would be down for legislation that does just that. So I think Republicans do themselves a disservice when they just simply go mental health, mental health. But if you had conversations on what that means and how you would do it, then we could go down that path and say, hey, you're probably going to have to give up something here and give the federal government a better look at you. But in doing so, if you prevent these things, then that might be the best thing to do. Because if you just try to prohibit, we are the country of innovation and technology. If you get rid of the AR, you don't think there's going to be things out there that are just as deadly and just as accessible? Of course there are, because we saw that in the 90s. So it's the idea that you're going to get rid of an object or a material and make the world safer in a country that's free just doesn't fly.
Johnny Joey Jones, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network.
I'm Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, and I'm inviting you to join a new conversation with the smartest thinkers out there about the country and where we're going. Subscribe to the Ben Domenech Podcast.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. KT McFarland. What's on your mind?
After the recent high-level U.S.-China talks in Alaska, there may be no going back. China and the U.S. are in a new Cold War. Actually, we've been in one for years, at least from China's perspective. But now U.S. leaders, even some of the woke socialists on the Democrat left and the Biden administration, they're waking up to the threat China poses to American peace and prosperity. It's unlikely any progress will be made on the core economic, trade, or human rights issues in these or subsequent U.S.-China negotiations. Why? Because Chinese Communist Party leaders believe the tides of history have turned, that China is a rising power and the U.S. a declining power, that centralized authoritarian governments are superior to dysfunctional democracies. In short, the Chinese believe they are already, or soon will be, the strongest nation in the world. Any concessions on major issues will come from others, not from China. In a way, the Chinese have done us a favor. They have put the new Cold War out in the open for all to see, but it is the last favor they will ever give us. Today, China speaks openly about its intentions. The 21st century belongs to them, and they plan to replace the United States as the dominant world power economically, technologically, militarily, politically, and diplomatically, and then rewrite the international rules of order to suit their own interests and at our expense. If we are to preserve the liberal world order, democracy, and free markets for the 21st century, the U.S. needs to come up with a new plan to deal with China. Just as we created a new world order to deal with the Soviet Union and communism after World War II, we must now do the same thing for dealing with China. And while history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. At the end of World War II, the world had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S. reached out to the nations devastated by the ravages of war, and through the Marshall Plan, helped rebuild their economies and societies. We did the same with our national security needs, creating and underwriting a system of mutual defense alliances in Europe and Asia. It worked brilliantly. The Biden administration, to its credit, has begun exploring a new alliance between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, the Quad. The question is, how far are they willing to take it? If it's merely an opportunity for the four nations to collectively grouse about China, the Quad will do little to stop China's push for dominance. Without concrete action, these are mere words and aspirations. Eventually, the Biden-Harris administration will have no choice but cave to China's demands. However, if we can band together with Japan, Australia, India, and stand up to China, and are willing and able to work together to deal with China's inevitable pushback, they just might preserve the international order from Chinese domination. China's wolf warrior diplomacy is already loose in Asia and the world. They use their trade, military, and cyber dominance to punish any country that dares stand up to them. Their plan is to pick us off one at a time until only the U.S. remains isolated and alone. If President Biden is unwilling or unable to craft a security alliance beginning with the Quad, the next Republican president will have to do it in 2024. I'm KT McFarland, and I was President Trump's first Deputy National Security Advisor, and I'm the author of the best-selling book, Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Stay on top of the latest news and information from Fox News. Listen and download the Fox News Hourly Update on your time. The trending stories you need anytime you want it. Listen and download now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.